Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. This is the first lecture. And oh, what a lecture it's going to be. Today, we are going to kind of set up the class. And what you guys remember from our class discussion this week, we discussed the fact that there are a couple of big questions we're going to look at in the class. One of them involves the ascendance of the United States on the international level. How does it become really one of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful country that's ever existed on the international level? But at the same time, we have this question of wealth and prosperity. And we're going to look at that. How does that reflect the economy? How is that a result of government institutions? And a big part of that is going to be the U.S. Constitution. Simply because, as you may know from even your high school history classes, there are a lot of places where when there's a push for rights for certain groups of people, there are places that would prefer not to give those rights to people. So the federal constitution becomes increasingly important throughout the 20th century in terms of advancing rights in the country. That being said, I think the best way to start off to hit on this major point there is to look at the U.S. Constitution and where it stands when this class begins. You guys know, if you've studied the Constitution, who here, by the way, has read the Constitution? Who here has read the whole thing? That's right. I'm looking at some of the Savannah, Hallie. I'm looking at you guys who've been in my class before. I'm like, Matt, I can't see you, but I'm like, you guys are like, yeah. So if you've read it, amendments 1 through 27. There hasn't been an amendment in 30 years now. So you guys don't really think in those terms. But for a lot of history, the amendments, adding amendments, if you look throughout this class, you'll see they come in bursts, right? I mean, there's a moment after the Civil War, right? There's a moment in the early 20th century during the Progressive Era. There are a couple in between, and then you see a burst kind of after World War II in the first 2 decades there. But they have real power for changing the way that the United States works, who has a voice, and ensuring that the rights that were secured in the Constitution expand to other people. And so that's going to be a big story of this class, how the Constitution plays into that and how people pushing for rights look to, or don't in certain times, look to the Constitution as a source of remedy for injustice. Most of you are American citizens. For those of you guys who aren't, you live here. We live under this code called the Constitution. It's a pretty remarkable document. And I hope in this class that you can see its power, both in terms of how it's expanded rights and in terms that there's just a fact about life that, to quote an old rap group from the late 80s, DMG, if you guys ever heard of them, no witness, no crime. And that has everything to do with the fact that rules are only as powerful as they are implemented. So these codes and these laws, these institutions, these rules, if you will, they matter a lot. As you guys have seen now, you're kind of coming into age, most of you, where you're paying attention to politics. And to quote the head of the U.S. Constitution Center, sometimes a bad time for American politics is a great time to study the Constitution, because we've been debating those questions for a long time. And, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of honest disinformation. I can say honest in the sense that some people just don't know. They repeat what they've heard before. That's a lot of what we do. And other people, the ones that kind of know how it works, they'll slant things, right? They'll angle things in ways. So as I said, when we had our first class meeting, what's going to be important to me in this class is that I leave you, when this class ends, not just with the grade, but with the sense that you can understand and navigate all of this information. And one of the things I want you guys to say to you guys here now, because it's really important, I mentioned in the first class, in our class meeting, I talked about how information works. And I also talked about, and we'll talk about this more in the next class meeting, how the way we think about the world is often shaped by those who raised us. And that in the course of years and years, the world changes. And sometimes the world changes before the lessons that we're taught can catch up. So one of the big things here with this is that there is a conception, I think, that in the world today, that there's still this idea that really trying to control people, trying to use your power, trying to use information to control people, is about keeping information away from people. Now that's the way it was for a long time, certainly. I mean, you look at the Soviet Union, we'll talk about in this class, as a great example of that, right? The communist regimes. North Korea still does it. They lagging behind a little bit over there. But controlling information is the way that you can control populations pretty powerfully up until the 20th century. But today, we live in an age where information is abundant, where it's really hard to keep information away from folks. And so the central skill, I think, is number one, you still got to look for the information. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight. But the skill that you and all of us really need to develop moving forward is not this idea that someone's hiding something from you. That matters. But you need to be able to sort through all of the information. Because at some point, people figured out if you can't keep information away from people, the best thing to do is just hit them with an endless barrage of incorrect news, of misinformation. And so now your job as citizens is to learn how to sort through that. And the best way to do that is to be educated enough to know better than to fall for it. The Constitution is a source of this, and that's why we're going to start off with that here in this class. The thing to know about the Constitution, first of all, and a lot of what I'll do in this class is I speak to what I hear a lot of people saying that's not true, that's half true. I engage with things that most of us know and share that are true. But one of the things I think that people don't appreciate about the Constitution is that it is not some divinely ordained document written by some, that it didn't come down to, on the mountaintop like it did, like Moses. This thing they stumbled into it. They tripped into this thing. And it only comes after 11 years following the Declaration of Independence, when the country, they try to throw something together out of these colonies that have very little in common. It does not work. And they very reluctantly, the people who agree to write this Constitution, the people who agree to adopt it, they very reluctantly adopt the Constitution to suit the needs of the time. And they did something smart, which was they made it amendable so that it could grow and change over time. But you can't actually understand the Constitution if you don't understand what was going on at the time. A lot of what's in there you might know, the background to the Boston Tea Party, right? The taxation, the lead up through the American Revolution. A lot of the rights that are embodied in the first 10 amendments are directly responding to what the British did. So the Third Amendment, for example, no quartering troops, in time of peace. That's a response to the fact that the British sent redcoats in and made people put them up in their houses. Can't take people out of, the Sixth Amendment, the rights on a criminal trial, that you have to be tried in the district in which the crime occurred. That was a response to the fact that the British were taking Americans, colonists, and sending them either up to Canada or across to England to try them, and you weren't going to get a fair shot by your peers there because everyone there looked at you like you were a rebel. So that's in there. The other set of problems they're responding to is the first attempt to put together institutions for the United States was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was really ineffective. The United States took on a ton of debt, both the national government and state governments. They borrowed like there was no tomorrow because they had to. Big part of that victory is getting the French in to support them. But once you borrow money from the French, you got to pay it back. On top of that, people in the cities, Americans, lent their money and they wanted this money back. And after the war, there's no way to collect it, particularly at the national level. The government had printed out currency that was worthless, called Continentals. They paid people in it. It would be like if I printed up History 20 bucks and was like, hey, you guys come wash my car. Here you go. Buy yourself something nice. Oh, no, it's not worth anything. It's not worth anything because it's not backed up by any gold. That's the kind of thing that they're dealing with. On top of that, they just won this war against the world's largest empire, which, by the way, highly unlikely statistically that was going to happen. They didn't even have a navy when this thing started. They win that war, and The British aren't done with them. Let me just give you, I lay this out for you guys. Maybe it's helpful. I try not to go back to the things from 2010 that I taught for the new students, but to think about this progression between independence to the Constitution. The best way I always think about it is the Declaration of Independence is a breakup letter. It's a breakup letter. You've been in a relationship a long time, and it's hard, right? You kind of don't know yourself unless you're with them. You finally go through some hard times. They refuse to go to counseling, and so you issue a Declaration of Independence saying, we are done. And here are the reasons we cannot be together. And suddenly the United States is single. No one believes they exist because they're essentially an insurrection inside of a British colony. But, when you've been in a long-term relationship and suddenly you're free, sometimes you stumble into what most people call a rebound. It doesn't work. You jump into it quick. You just kind of needed to fill that gap. That's the Articles of Confederation. You didn't really think it through. And over time, you're like, oh my God, this isn't right for me. But you kind of also don't want to admit that maybe you need something different. Maybe you do need somebody to tell you to take a shower. You know what I'm saying? Maybe you do need somebody to tell you to clean up the house. And so finally, after 11 years of this, they get together in 1787 and they go, all right. And that's when the states bond together in the American marriage that is the United States of America under the Constitution. See, the Constitution, that's the one you marry. Get out of that rebound. Move on. And now, almost 2.5 centuries later, still married. Oh my God. What is the gem for the 250th anniversary? Do they have one of those? Oof, one day. I don't know. So that's where we are. They got to pay back their debt. Under the Articles, this rebound, the national government could not require that any states pay taxes to pay off this debt. That's a bit of a problem, right? I mean, I don't know about you guys. If on April 15th, a dude shows up at your door and says, he didn't say that. He makes that noise, obviously. Knocks on the door and he's like, hey, it's April 15th. I was just wondering if you might want to pay your taxes. You'd be like, you asking me, do I want to pay my taxes? Like, yeah, yes, sir, please. Please, will you pay your taxes? We need to pay off this debt. The French are getting angry. And if we don't pay them back, they won't loan us any more money, and no one else will, and the British will come back and take us, and we'll be forced to go live with them again. You'd be like, that sounds heavy, but, I'm thinking, like, if everybody else just pays their taxes, we'll be fine, right? It doesn't work. So you got to figure out a way to tax. Then you're going to build this strong government. One of the problems under the Articles of Confederation is that all these regions inside of the colonies, or now the states, just decide they're independent. They're like, we're a new state now. And there's nothing you can do, especially the Hill people, dude. Hill people, don't mess with them. A whole place called State of Franklin, what is today Eastern Tennessee. Those guys were like, we're a state now. And the government of North Carolina is like, no, you're not. And they're like, come try to stop us. And they're like, no thanks. They can't do anything about it. There's no way to raise an army and deal with this stuff. And so they sit down and they start trying to solve these problems in the Constitution. Now, they're going to give more power to the federal government. But that's worrying because these states don't think of themselves as Americans yet. These people, they thought about themselves as English subjects, and then that ended. Now they think about themselves being from their states. They don't think, well, but guess we're Americans now. That's not a thing. You got a couple of people who think that way, Washington being one of them, George Washington. But most folks are like, no. In Massachusetts, the descendants of the religiously very, 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 very intense Puritans, things have changed there now, but you have an economy that's growing based on trade, and the diverse economy developing up there with small towns. You think they want to just sit down and go, all right, cool, let's bind up with South Carolina's plantation slave economy? No. Do you think that Virginia, which is the most populous and wealthiest state at the time, which has almost no war debt, would like to sit down at the table with, again, Massachusetts, has a massive amount of debt. So much debt that the people, actually the veterans of the Revolutionary War, are rising up and trying to overthrow the government of Massachusetts in the 1780s. But they look at it all and they eventually say, all right, well, maybe we should do this because we do have some problems together. So if we're going to do it, we need to make sure that we have a voice in this, and we may need to make sure that the states have a check, and we need to make sure that representation is fair. Sit down and they meet. And this is where they come up with the Constitution. James Madison brings in what's called the Virginia Plan. There are several people who contribute to this. In the summer of 1787, they get together. They spend weeks writing this thing, months. They got from the beginning, basically the end of the summer. And let me just tell you, they're in Philadelphia. I don't know if you guys have been to Philadelphia in summer, or mostly anywhere in summer. It's very hot. It's hot. It's humid. They're doing this in secret, by the way, because they are not authorized to write this document. They're supposed to be making changes to the Articles of Confederation. They get in there, they shut the doors, they lock them, they close the windows, and they say, here's the deal. We're just going to throw that one in the garbage and write a whole new document. And that means that if anyone finds out what they're doing, delegates will be recalled back home because they do not have the authority to do this. So they have to be super secret the whole summer. And that means keeping the windows and doors closed all the time in the summer. Have you guys seen how people dress back then? You seen them wool pantaloons? You seen them neck tufts? Stuff's made out of wool. You got your old wig on. Smell like old dudes in there. It was like basically colonial America's version of the YMCA locker room. You know what I'm saying? Except for they kept their clothes on, which somehow was worse. And they write this in secrecy. People with very different viewpoints on things. Got to find a compromise. It's clear that the problems they need to solve are getting more and more intense. The big issue is representation. How are we going to represent? The United States going to be represented in this. And this is where this compromise comes in. Compromise that they strike is that there shall be 2 houses of the legislature. This is Article 1. There'll be a House of Representatives and a Senate. The Senate, think about this, the root, Senate, senior, senator, means elder. They're going to have to be older. They're going to serve longer terms. They're going to serve 6-year terms is what they eventually work out. In the House of Representatives, it's going to be a 2-year term. Be younger to be in there. And the idea is that the balance between the two of those, they don't want there to be some revolutionary just wiping out of everything at one time. This is one of the reasons they stagger the terms. The House is 2 years, the Senate is 6 years, the President is 4 years, and the Supreme Court is on good behavior, which kind of sounds like what your parents would say would get you to the movies. Like, you can go to the movies on good behavior, though, on good behavior. Don't make me not let you go see Toy Story 8 and also remove you from the bench of the Supreme Court. That's another funny thing about the Supreme Court is that literally my son Solomon could be on the Supreme Court if the president appointed him and the Senate confirmed him. That's all it takes. There's no age requirements. There's no educational requirements. It's just like, hey, did the president say you could be there? And then the Senate, did the Senate say that? Okay, cool. That's it. Before we go back to the Congress, which is, again, Article 1. This is the longest part because this is the part they have the most experience with. They didn't have an executive under the Articles of Confederation. There are courts, but there's not a Supreme Court under that. So this is the thing they know best. And this, friends, if you notice, this is where almost all of the decisions are made. So they have these 2 houses, senators, 6 years. And if you read when you read the Constitution, you'll be like, it says there'll be like some that are 2, some that are 4, some that are 6. That's confusing you guys. But they do that to stagger the terms so that no more than basically a third of the Senate can change at any time. So every 2 years there are senatorial elections, but not everybody's up for election. Consistency. The idea is that these supposed to be older people that have more of the long view. They're not subject to the changing whims of people's desires. And they also, and this is going to be true until the 17th Amendment, which is going to be passed in 1913. So this is the way it is in this quiz that we're having, which goes up to the 15th Amendment and treats the Constitution as the moment when this class begins in 1877. What they decide there is that for senators, since they're so powerful, we're not going to let the people elect those. Power to elect senators is vested in the hands of state legislatures. So like in Nashville, we have our legislature here, right? Our Congress. Every state has their Capitol building where their government meets. And that is who appoints senators until 1913. They're not elected by the people. Which brings me to a point that I should make clear here. One of the real reasons that they're writing this Constitution is because they are terrified of what the people are going to do. Like the people in Massachusetts who were trying to overthrow the government of Massachusetts, or the people in the western part of North Carolina who were declaring themselves an independent state, or these people up in like upstate New York and kind of like over a little bit further west and inland, these people who have broken away from that state, declared themselves a republic, and are starting to talk about joining Canada. That's Vermont. Eventually they sober up and make the right choice. But the people are a threat to these folks. These are very wealthy people sitting in this room. So they don't want to give the people a whole lot of power. They're worried. And in fact, I'll talk about this in a minute. They don't really trust that the people should be given a whole lot of choice. And this idea of the people, on top of that, that's going to be decided by the states. Who are the people? That's going to be a decision of the states until the second half of the 19th century. So that's the Senate. Now you got the House. The House every 2 years, it's the people. It has less power in most matters than the Senate does, because the Senate's going to have a lot of power to check the president. But the House every 2 years, it's always been elected by the people. It's based on population. Whereas the Senate, every state has two. That's the equal representation part. The House is going to so a state like Virginia would never agree to it if they're like, so everybody's going to have the same amount of votes. That's nuts. We got a lot more people. Talking about Rhode Island up there, have the same as us. But Rhode Island's like, well, we're not going to do it based on population. So they worked that out. They have those two houses. Senate based upon every state having an equal vote, and then the House based on population there. The second big issue here is slavery. As you guys know, they don't solve this situation at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, it's not discussed a whole lot. Now, there's a couple of reasons why they don't take this on. Number one, there is abolitionist sentiment in that room. There are people who despise slavery in that room, but not most of them. The Southern plantation owners, and let me say this, I want to get this on the record. What a slave plantation looks like and what slavery looks like at this time is much different than what it looks like later on into the 19th century once the cotton plantations come in. But, what's going on here? The phone is supposed to be plugged in and charging. Sorry about this. Oh well, we're good. So with slavery, these plantations don't look the same. The world of cotton and the first global economy that is based on it is going to create essentially a torture mill for human beings. Slavery this time is brutal too. I mean, I think just simply saying that you are owned by another human being according to them, that is a brutal thing. But it's different at this time. It certainly has control in southern states, but not like it's going to later on. But really what it comes down to is everybody in that room realizes there's a lot at stake. And so the Southerners are not going to cede on this. But the people who are against slavery, even the Northerners that don't have a whole lot of interest in it, and there is slavery in the North. You guys should know this. There are enslaved people throughout the northern states. There aren't plantations by and large, but there are enslaved people who work in homes and things like that and do smaller stuff, right? So it does exist. This is a common misconception. Those states in the North decide not to fight over it. They decide to let it slide. And a big reason for that, and by the way, let me be clear about this. When I explain these things, I don't want anybody to suddenly go, well, see, it wasn't that bad. That's ridiculous. There's a difference between bringing in information as a fact and people who try to bring up information as a mitigating factor to a horrible human tragedy. You will not find me on the latter of those two parts of the story. So people in the North were looking at the economy at the time, and there is a very real way that if you were looking at the world in 1787 when they wrote this, you could conclude that slavery will be gone soon anyway, or at least the plantations. The two major crops at this time, tobacco and rice, the plantations are not faring well. In fact, even George Washington, who owns enslaved people, while he is the president, he is taking out loans from what is essentially the 18th century's version of pawn shops with massive interest on it. He refuses to take a salary. He doesn't think that's right. But he's broke. Thomas Jefferson dies in massive debt. So this is kind of the way the economies of these plantations are going. If, people like to have a little something to make them sleep better at night. And so if you want to say this is going to be gone soon, that's fine. That helps you, I guess. But that is a real sentiment in the room. And if you look at it from their perspective, it's not completely irrational to reach that conclusion. What they don't know is about the same time a guy named Eli Whitney is inventing a cotton gin that is going to radically transform the plantation, transform American slavery, and create this even more brutal form of production. It's also going to entrench a very wealthy and powerful group of Southerners in control of Southern politics, who its entire power base rests on slavery, such to the point that if they ever felt like it might be threatened, they would secede from the country. I don't want to spoil it for you. They're going to. Bad idea, though. So they move on past it. There are a couple of passages in there. And this is the great thing about the Southerners there a lot of them at the Constitutional Convention. On the one hand, they're like, hey, guys, we're trying to protect property here. These enslaved people, that's our property, man. You can't take us away. That's what the king would do, man. You can't. They're like, you can't do it. It's our property. And that's the point they cede on. But here's the funny thing. Remember how I told you that representation in the House of Representatives is based on your population? Well, guess what? Guess who's suddenly people in the eyes of the Southerners? Enslaved folks. They're like, oh, you got to count them, man. You don't want to leave them out. It's very convenient. They eventually strike the compromise, which you guys know, which is 3/5 compromise, in which 3/5 of the population of the enslaved people in a state shall count towards representation, even those people shall not be able to vote. It will have a tremendous impact on the slave states' seats in the House of Representatives and thus national politics, because they will be counted. And as the population rises, that gives the southern states more seats in the House of Representatives. It's also a really damn good reason why the argument that that the Civil War, when the states seceded, they were just doing what the people wanted. They wanted not to be interfered with their way of life. They just, those people just wanted to be free and not mess with. And I'm like, did you know that most of the people in South Carolina were black? I'm not sure that we can say the will of the people was adequately reflected when half the population was not asked. Mississippi as well. But I'll go back to this. So that's it. There's also a clause in there saying the international slave trade shall not be abolished until 10 years after, essentially 10 years after this goes into effect, 1808. It is immediately ended, which just creates an internal market, which rips families apart from the old South, from Virginia and North Carolina, and sends them down to the cotton plantations. And here's the last issue, and this is a good one. They debate whether or not there should be an executive. In other words, should there be a president? This is not something everyone agrees on. This is a group of people that has just experienced a war, years long, based on the fact that one person had too much power. They felt that they were stepped on. And they felt like giving one person a massive amount of power will be a problem. They understood this. They understood what power did to people, and they wanted to make sure that it was checked. But on the other end of things, they also just came out of this Articles of Confederation, where you could pass all the laws in the world you wanted to. I mean, they couldn't. It wasn't that effective. They were pretty bad at doing it. But you can pass laws, and like I said, a law is only as good as its enforcement. So they said, for expediency, we might need an executive, a president, a person who, when Congress passes laws, a person who is responsible for executing those laws, hence executive branch. So in that sense, when Congress passes a tax, the executive handles that through the Department of Treasury. When Congress declares war, the president handles that through, at the time, the Department of War, now the Department of Defense. The executive, in their mind, is responsible for executing the will of the Congress because, as I said, almost all of the power to make decisions in the Constitution is vested in the legislature. We've forgotten that. Let me get my Red Bull. Let me get this back up. All right. Solomon, my son, loves gauges, like in cars. And he like, if somebody comes over, he'll be like, "Can you let me get in your car?" It's like his thing. It's like COVID now. It's like if somebody comes over, they walk away from the car and he goes, looks at the gauges. So now Solomon has gauges. If you ask him to show his gauge, he'll walk over to you and be like, "I'm hungry. My food gauge is down." And it's funny when he sees me drinking Red Bull, he's like, "Daddy, your Red Bull gauge is up." And I'm like, "You're damn right it is, boy. You're damn right it is." Anyway, he has all kinds of gauges. He's like, "Daddy, my chocolate candy gauge is pretty low." I'm like, "Dad, you don't have it. That doesn't work." But actually it does so. All right, so you've got the executive. What power is vested in the executive? And this is Article 2. Very little, actually. In fact, anyone who's in my class before, anyone who knows this, what is the one unchecked power that the president has in the United States? This just happened recently. As a matter of fact, we just saw this. It's a power that tends to be most regularly exercised at the very end of a president's time in office.
Isn't it pardons?
Yes, they have the power of the pardon. There is no check on that. The only thing it says is that it does not apply to cases of impeachment. It only applies to federal cases, so you can't pardon somebody for a state crime, but you can pardon anybody you want to. There was even recent discussion, you guys probably heard it, about the question of whether or not you could pardon yourself. That is still, I think most scholars would say, no, you can't, for an interpretation. Other people, some people have argued that it could be possible. It doesn't say you can't. I was texting with a buddy of mine when all this was going on, and he brought up the issue of, the people who went into the Capitol building, right, during on January 6th, and something about pardoning them. And he was like, well, the president can't do that, right? The president couldn't pardon them because they won't even go on trial until after he's out of office, right? So he said, they can't do that, right? And I'm like, no. This is the thing about the pardon. Just ask old Richard Nixon. We'll talk about that later on. You can actually be pardoned for any crime you may have committed, which essentially covers you for anything you did up to that point. Now, you can't pardon somebody for the future. You can't be like, look, this dude shoots somebody in like 6 weeks, he's good. After 6 weeks, no, you can't do that. But what you can is pardon for anything that may have happened before that. It didn't happen, but it blew his mind. Did you guys know that? Anybody know that? That you can? That's right. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for any crimes he did or may have committed. That's a thing you can do. Aside from that, the president has some particularly powerful roles. Commander-in-Chief, when called into duty by Congress. Chief Diplomat, but any treaties negotiated through the executive office, and that is done through the State Department, which is our diplomatic corps. Secretary of State handles that. Any treaties that are negotiated by the executive are subject to approval by the Senate. The president can appoint Supreme Court justices, but they must be approved by the Senate. You can see the reason in rhyme in this when you read it. These folks were terrified of giving that much power to somebody. But in their mind, just to summarize what I would say is, you don't tell them they can have all the guns and also tell them they can fire whenever they want to. You got to ask. This comes out of a long line of fear about concentrated power and tyranny. It is a principle idea on the minds of the founders. And that is why George Washington is crucial to having this position created. Washington's not an intellectual. Washington's not, a guy who's going to write things like the Declaration of Independence. He doesn't have like some academic pedigree. He's a surveyor. But Washington's crucial here because they bring him in to be the president of this constitutional convention. And they do that for credibility. He barely says anything at the constitutional convention. He presides over it. He's the president of that meeting. But him being in the room, you cannot overestimate the degree to which that matters. Because if you are worried about one person taking over, about giving that much power to one person, about what might happen, will that person ever cede power? Will that person use their power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces to stay in power? George Washington had less than a decade before this won a victory over the largest empire in the world and one of the most insane odds that the world has ever seen. And when that war concluded, he was one of only 2 Americans that most people knew across the entire country, him and Ben Franklin. And Washington handed over the sword, went back home. I don't have time to get into how incredible that is. It's one of these gifts that I say we've been inherited, is you don't get that a whole lot. A lot of times when revolutions happen, the person who is the chief principal leader of that revolution decides that this place can't exist without their leadership, and they institutionalize their power for the rest of their lives. A couple of examples: French Revolution with Napoleon, Russian Revolution with what becomes Stalin. It doesn't start off with Stalin, but he manages to seize power and do that. He was one of the early leaders of that revolution. Cuba, Fidel Castro. China, Mao Zedong. The list goes on and on. Revolutions that have these leaders rarely end up with leaders who are so checked in their desire for power. So if you're going to create this position everyone's worried about, you're kind of looking at Washington. Washington knows. He's like, damn it. He doesn't want that position, but he knows that he's the only one that everyone will trust. And like so often in his life, Washington, when he is called to duty, he steps up and fulfills it. And he is going to set a lot of the precedents for the commander-in-chief. Couple of things here. To get back to that whole part about how the founders were worried about the people, when they decide they're going to have an executive, there's a whole period of time where they debate how long are they going to serve, how do we pick them, like what powers they have. And during that debate, there's a really great exchange where when they're saying who should elect the president, and the original idea is like, maybe we'll let the Congress elect the president. And then people are like, that seems like a bad idea. Then they would just get rid of him and put a new one in whenever they want him to. Don't we need to have a check and balance? And they're like, okay, that's cool. So they go, well, how are we going to do it? And one day, a guy named Gouverneur Morris, pretty important guy in the founding generation, Gouverneur Morris stands up and says, I believe that the people should be able to select the president of the United States. So he doesn't say president, he says the executive. They call it different things at the time. I believe we should let the people select it, as they shall never fail to select an honorable person for this position. And he gets roasted. I mean, George Mason from Virginia stands up and says, let the people pick the president? And that's about as good as letting a blind person pick the best color. That is almost literally what he says. And he is seconded and thirded by everyone else. Really? The people? Are you kidding me? And what the argument is, they say is, the people shall never fail to be duped by some designing individual who wants to take that office for their own purposes. We cannot leave that in the hands of the people. That's their argument. That's why it's a little bit funny whenever you watch people talking about the founders wanted the people to select the president. I'm like, quite the opposite. Yeah, a couple of them did, but they were like, oh yeah, never mind, you're right, that would be crazy. So they decide on the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is a check system. Because the Electoral College, the electors are appointed. They are not members of the state legislature. They are selected in the manner decided by the state legislatures. And there is a representative or a elector in the Electoral College for each seat that the House that the state has in Congress. So every state gets 2 by virtue of having a senator, and because the Constitution assures that no state, regardless of their population, shall be without at least 1 seat in the House, you have a minimum of 3, but as states grow, they have more votes in the Electoral College. Again, another reason why that 3/5 compromise, allowing the southern states to count the 3/5 of their enslaved population when we're talking millions of people by the mid-19th century, another reason why that gives them a huge amount of influence in the federal government they wouldn't have otherwise. So that's the way they work it all out. And then, Article 3, we get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's role isn't quite clear at first. But, by the way, how many Supreme Court justices does it say there will be in the Constitution? You're all right. You didn't say anything, so it doesn't say anything about it in the Constitution either. That's a matter decided by Congress. So there have been as many as 10 at one point, and I think there have been as few as 5. I can't totally remember, but it's subject to, Congress can change that. That's within the rules. So there we go. That's the 3 branches. And there's more to it in the Constitution. I just wanted to get through this and explain why they're there. Now you get through the rest of the Constitution, and you've got other issues. The states. It guarantees which powers are vested in the states. You've got the amendment process. And this is an interesting process too. They know they're going to be able to amend it. And this is going to be important because a lot of states will not agree to ratify this Constitution unless there are some amendments to it. So that's going to provide a pretty important part of it. For the amendment process for the Constitution, the founders wanted to make it possible to amend the Constitution. That's the reason it's been able to live so long. But they did not want to make it easy. So there's 2 ways you can amend the Constitution in the Constitution. And you can see in this, even though it's not necessarily something that's happened before, you can see in this they're concerned about the federal government giving it too much power. Because the first way you can amend the Constitution is the only way that it's ever happened. That is, both houses of Congress pass it by 2/3. So not just 50%. It can be 2/3 of both houses of Congress. It's then sent out to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. So that's one way. That's the way it's always happened. But the other way, which is telling, is that they made another process called, you would call it what's called a convention of states. If you can get 2/3 of the states together in a convention, perhaps not unlike the Constitutional Convention, which had been called by the states, get 2/3 of them together, they can propose, without the federal government, they can propose an amendment to the Constitution. And again, if 3/4 of the states sign on to it, then it becomes a part of the Constitution. That's never happened, but it was a way that they wanted to make sure that if the federal government was not responding to their needs, the states could take matters into their own hands. You've got oaths, a matter of oaths. It tells you which oaths need to be taken in the Constitution. And then there is the one thing that the Constitution says about religion at all. It says one thing in there. It says that no religious oaths shall ever be required to hold office under the United States. So the one statement about religion in the entire thing simply says you may never be required to be a member of a certain religion to serve in the federal government. And that brings up an important point. That brings up an important point that for some reason we're still fighting about, even though it's kind of an ahistorical debate. And this question goes down as, the religious nature of the Constitution of the country in general. It's kind of a conflated conversation we have. And on this point, I'm sorry to say that almost anyone here who has one of these too strong opinions on it is going to be a little bit disappointed when you go to the evidence. The too strong opinions that I hear generally go, this country was founded as a Christian country and the Constitution is a Christian document. And the other side goes, no, it's not. Okay. No, it's not. Not all the founders were Christians. And that's a totally separate debate. This is where a lot of times when you look at the evidence, it does not support your more zealous friends. So let's break this down. And this, I'll tell you, this is this perspective. I've been teaching this. I've reached these conclusions on my own. But there's a brilliant book on this called "Was America Founded as a Christian Nation" by John Fea. John Fea himself is an evangelical Christian who teaches at Messiah University, and he is a brilliant scholar. And let me tell you, my argument that I've been making, enhanced by the brilliance of this man. He starts off the book. That's not even really a question that would make any sense to the founders. It actually his publisher made him make that the title. He didn't want to make that the title because he felt like it wasn't fair, because he was like that. His whole point is that, sometimes publishers do things to sell more books, right? It's a provocative title. But he says that question would not have even made sense to the founders. And it wouldn't have. That question about whether or not the United States was a Christian nation really started popping up in the 1970s with the rise of the organized evangelical movement. It's an ahistorical question. So you get down to this. Let's test this theory. Let's test the idea that the document was founded, that the country was founded explicitly as a Christian country. You guys will read the Constitution. You guys have read the Constitution. How many times does it mention Jesus in there? Not a single time. How many times does it mention God in there? In the year of our Lord, which that's basically saying AD, and it's Domini. That's it. Doesn't. I don't know about you guys. I ain't never been to church and they didn't mention Jesus. All right. When you're thinking real hard about creating something, when you have a religious thing, you talk about it. You put it in there, right? You sing about it. It's there. It's right in front of you. So the argument that this is an explicitly Christian document simply does not hold water. But to support the people who say that it is, they'll say, well, they were Christians. They prayed. To which I would respond, so just because someone is a Christian who does something, that means the thing they're doing is inherently Christian? So if I give my truck an oil change and I'm a Christian, was that a Christian oil change I gave it? It's kind of a ridiculous question, right? Because one can have faith and do things that are not essentially of that faith. Now, to all the people in the room who were getting real sure of themselves, being like, see, I told you, Mom, it wasn't blah. Let me also back up on this, because that's the problem with it, is people follow the evidence and they go, see, well, it doesn't hold water that this, was founded as a Christian nation. They get real sure of themselves. Christianity was fundamentally important to the early history of the United States. Absolutely was. Several of the colonies' origins go back to the desire to expand faith. Not a faith you guys would recognize, by the way. Read up on the Puritans. They would cut people's ears off and send them back to England. They weren't real tolerant. People go, it's about religious tolerance. Oh, God. Tell a Puritan something that's not Puritan, and good luck with that. That's another story. But the point is that faith has guided people, and faith guided many of the founders. They felt that. That was part of their lives. So that's where, with this question, unfortunately for everyone who wants to have a real strong, opinionated, go on the news talk shows and just lay it into them, unfortunately, the truth of the matter of Christianity's importance in the early republic, it's just it's really more nuanced than either one or the other. So it's always kind of amazed me too how, well, first of all, one of the 10 Commandments is, shall not lie. So pushing forward a lie because it supports your agenda, I would say that might not be in line with most people's faith, right? Especially the three main faiths that we have in the United States all go back to the Old Testament, right? But at the same time, I've never quite understood, and this is just me, right? And I'm saying this is me, okay? So this is just my take on it. I've never quite understood why, if one person feels that Jesus is their Savior, that it matters particularly strongly to them whether or not Benjamin Franklin felt the same way. I just can't imagine God going, what? Franklin wasn't a Christian? Oh, man. Like, I think he already knows, right? So that's my point. Your faith is yours. It doesn't have to be based in a fake history. If your faith is real to you, it's yours. But be honest. That's my talk on it. But another thing to remember is that when you think about Christianity today, back then it wasn't like you were thinking. You were like, they had Baptists and they had Catholics, what's the difference between a Catholic and a Baptist? The Catholic will say Haiti in the liquor store. You guys ever heard that joke? That was like a big one that my mom told me. My mom told me that one. She's like, hey. We were Methodist, so we were out of it. Anyway, she, that was just one of those jokes that went around. And it also, like, that goes for every one of them, right? That's an old street joke that you can throw anybody into. But obviously, don't think that I'm dissing your faith. It was just a dumb joke. But, faith at that time, if you want to understand why these guys are like, no religious oath required, it's because it wasn't like, right? Like, you guys, like, I don't know, man, in the South, man, you're hanging out. You got friends who are Baptists, you got friends who are Methodists, you got friends who are Presbyterians, you come together and do things together in like some charity or whatever. That's fine. Oh, no, friends, that's not quite how it worked back then. I mean, you're talking like sometimes your king was Catholic and he would murder people who were Protestant. And sometimes the guy was Protestant and you'd have to go to war because those guys were over there and everybody's like, the Pope is pulling the strings on this thing. It was pretty intense. They wanted to make sure that none of that influence shaped the way the country works because it's a set of rules. But the one thing to remember, again, for those people who discover that there's no, this statement about the Constitution being Christian, one of the things to also remember is that one of the first guarantees put in the Constitution is the right for your faith to be protected. So there's that balance. On the one hand, they did not want one single church dominating. They put that in there. But on the other hand, they wanted to make sure that people were free to follow their own faith. It's almost like you don't have to have the faith to respect someone who has it. I don't know, man. That might sound crazy, but that's just me. So that's kind of the Constitution in a nutshell. Now, I will conclude. It gets sent out. It has to be debated at the state level. We can talk more about that as we roll into the next lecture where we get up to the Civil War and kind of begin where we stopped in History 2010. But now, if you guys want to stick around, I'll do a quick overview of Amendments 1 through 10, and I'll give you my hand gestures to remember them. And then I've got a couple for the other ones too. Because remember, for this, you've got to know the Amendments 1 through 15. All right, are you guys ready? Are you guys ready for my hand gestures to remember this? You guys ready? You guys ready for my hand gestures? I got hand gestures, right? These devices, okay? You got these devices. I was like, look at my devices, dude. Now I get them. Sounds like something I'd say to Solomon. I'd be like, my devices are broken. Oh, so here we go. All right, now, for those of you guys who were in my class last semester, I did these. Did they work at all? Did they help at all? How they did help? Okay, cool. That's great. That was a firm endorsement. Thank you. So, I'm going to show them to you, but you can't get mad at me, all right? I need you guys to, right now, promise me that you won't get mad at me, all right? If you don't get mad at me, you can just leave right now, all right? I got to show them to you. Some of you guys might be mad at me for showing these to you, but they're going to work. All right, you guys ready? You guys ready for this? All right, here we go. The First Amendment is your freedom of expression. So, hey, Sam, no, I did not. Sam went like that. That's different, Sam. That's two fingers, all right? I don't appreciate that. That means that you felt it, okay? I went like this right here, one, because it's the First Amendment, all right? The First Amendment. That's crazy. By the way, nobody screenshot me and then post it and be like, liberal professor flips off class after telling him that God's dead. Like, come on, guys. Give me a little grace here, all right? You're going to cancel me on day one. Anyway, it's always funny when I'm teaching in school, too, because, like, I'll do it. And then I'll always look over at the window on the door and be like, did somebody just walk by and be like, it's very confusing. That professor was flipping off his students, but they were smiling back. I'm not sure what kind of an accord they have in there, but it seems like they're getting along. Maybe I should try that. And then, that's how we lose them. Anyway, it's a freedom of expression, right? And there's 5 parts of that, right? Freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, to peaceably assemble, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom to petition the government, right? So that's there. You guys kind of know those, right? Second Amendment, boom, that's your right to bear arms, all right? So for the well-regulated militia. It always does crack me up when people are like, don't put regulations on my guns because the Second Amendment. I'm like, the word regulated is in there. Just going to bring that up. Anyway, so Second Amendment, boom. 3, the Third Amendment. All right, you guys ready for this? Okay, so you know how 2's company but 3's a crowd? You know what I'm saying? 2's company, but 3's a crowd. Get out of here, British soldier. You can't stay in here. No soldiers during peacetime, all right? Because 2's company, 3's a crowd. Oh, redcoat in there eating up all your good ham. That's not cool. Leaving you the stale bread, Anyway, that's 3. All right, the Fourth Amendment. Now, and by the way, this doesn't cover every element of these. This is to help you get a structure in your head. So read them thoroughly, but this will help you keep them in order, hopefully. So that's the third. Get out of here, right? Okay, the Fourth Amendment. Now, for this one to work, you have to have lost a finger, okay? So you lost a finger, and on a table saw probably. That's how most people lose fingers, I think. Anyway, my great uncle Grover Cleveland Sawyer. One day my dad was just with him, and they had a potato digger out behind a plow, and he reached down and it just cut his finger off. Just cut my uncle Grover Cleveland's finger off, and my dad was like, yeah, he just cut it right off. And I was like, well, what'd he do? And my dad said he picked it up and wrapped it up in a handkerchief, put it in his pocket, and kept on plowing. I was like, damn, Grover Cleveland Sawyer. That is some old things, man. That's some old stuff. Anyway, so you lost your finger, maybe a potato digger, or maybe more likely table saw, okay? And you're having a bad day, and then suddenly somebody shows up and goes, I'm going to search your house now. And you go, whoa, 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 whoa. Look, I'm having a bad day here. But you cannot come in here without a warrant. I don't want to see any unreasonable searches. So you see what I'm saying? Like, you're just like, you don't have a finger on that hand. You got 4, and that's your Fourth Amendment, right? Don't come in here and search. You guys got it? Okay. You got to remember that one because we'll need it later. All right, so the Fifth Amendment. There are a couple of parts of this, but to keep this straight, here's 2 of them. The Fifth Amendment ensures that you have the right not to bear witness against yourself and it's right to not self-incriminate. So you take your 5 fingers and you go, fifth, pleading the fifth. That's right there, okay? So you got that one. But also, it's eminent domain. And this is the right of the government to take property from you, but they have to pay you back, right? So they can take government land for public use, but they have to give you just compensation for it, right? So you take your 5 fingers and you go, hey, if you take it away from me, you're going to pay me back, all right? So you guys got that right there? That's just 2 of them. There's a couple of other ones there, right? Double jeopardy and all that. No double jeopardy. All right, so the Sixth Amendment. And these are the 2 that I think are probably the most useful. Because the Sixth and Seventh Amendment deal with the rights of the accused. Right? So those are the people who are on trial and basically how the court system works out. Right? And what rights do you have and what are the terms. All right? So, the Sixth Amendment. All right? 6. Sixth Amendment says you have the right to a trial by jury of your peers in the district in which the crime occurred, fair and speedy trial, in the district in which the crime occurred. Right? It's a criminal trial. That's what it pertains to, a criminal trial. And on a criminal trial, that's the one where you go in by yourself, you're put on trial by the state, right, the DA, and in front of a jury of your peers. So there you are, and there's your peers over here. Cool? There you go. That's the Sixth Amendment. The Seventh Amendment is your rights on trial and a right to a trial by jury in a civil case where its value is worth more than $20. That's still in there. They still hold that up. A lot more back then. So the Seventh Amendment is a civil trial. And a civil trial, for those of you guys who don't know the difference, a civil trial is like Judge Judy. You guys know where there's like a plaintiff and a defendant, right? And they're against each other. It's not the state putting you on trial. You are putting another person. You were claiming against another person. You go in there, you've got a defendant, and you've got a plaintiff over here. And then, guess what? If it's worth more than $20, you've got a jury of your peers over here too. Cool? You could also go like this and go civil if you want to, if that works. But 2, right? Criminal, civil. Both jury of your peers. Cool? All right. Now, the last one I've got a good hand signal for is the Eighth Amendment. And here's how this works, okay? You've got to have lost that finger from the Fourth Amendment, okay? Remember the one that you were waving around being like, get out of here, you can't search without a warrant unless you have reasonable... Remember that hand? Okay, cool. Well, you're having a bad day later on. Fortunately, you got that person out of there because you got your Fourth Amendment right to say no without a warrant. But then you lost your job because you had a job where you needed this. By the way, you guys are probably wondering why I'm doing my pinky. It's because don't lose your thumb. Even in an imaginary scenario, don't lose your thumb. You need it. It's what separates us from a lot of other animals. So you got this. You still miss your finger and you lost your job because for some reason you need it. I guess you were a hand model. And then you went into a store and you were like, I got to feed my kids. So you steal a loaf of bread and then someone goes, oh, you stole a loaf of bread. And they chop off another finger. And now you've only got 8 fingers. And you're like, whoa, 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 that was cruel and unusual punishment. You cannot do that here. Why are so many of my rights being abused all at the same time? That's the Eighth Amendment, right? No cruel and unusual punishment. It is not the right to cruel and unusual punishment. I have seen people write that the Eighth Amendment is your right to cruel and unusual punishment. No, it is your right not to be cruel and not to have excessive bails or fines imposed. The Ninth and 10th Amendment work together. Come to the study sessions, we'll talk about them. Basically, the Ninth Amendment says that that the rights that people have is not limited to the rights laid out in the Constitution. So there are those that are secured in the Constitution, but more rights exist. Right? So no one can ever say, well, I don't see your right to drive a car in the Constitution, so therefore it's not a real right. You go, no, there's more than those that are embedded here. And the 10th Amendment says that any power not specifically given to the federal government is reserved to the states or to the people. The 11th Amendment. Read it, but it's hard. I'm still trying to figure out how to explain it. It's about states suing each other in court. Read it, but don't get too stressed out about it. It's not one that's easily understood. The 12th Amendment, though. The 12th Amendment. You guys ready for this? Okay, the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment does not get the credit it deserves. It's passed in 1804. Let me just tell you, in the original Constitution, the executive was selected by means of by the Electoral College. And the way it worked was the most votes in the Electoral College, that was the president. And the second most votes in the Electoral College, that person became vice president. So, you guys don't think about the 12th Amendment much, but if it weren't for the 12th Amendment right now, we'd have President Biden and Vice President Donald Trump. Or, my favorite combination, in the last election, we would have had President Donald Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton, which is a hilarious theme for a reality show, but a terrible theme for the United States of America. That one's always been funny to me because those guys did not get along at all. I always imagine like Donald Trump would be up at like 3 a.m. in the morning, like tweeting with one hand and eating potato chips, and then Hillary Clinton jump out of a cabinet and be like, collusion, and like scurry off into the dark. You know what I'm saying? It would be a whole weird situation. Yeah, we can make fun of everybody. That's kind of a weird thing, isn't it? Also, they don't both live in the White House, guys. They don't live together. It's not like, well, you're the vice president, you're roommates now. So that's not even a real scenario. Although we can make it be. The world's a weird place. The 13th, 14th, and 15th, which come after the Civil War, I will discuss in the next lecture as we get in moving this. It is the abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment, which establishes birthright citizenship, establishes equal representation. It's a really important amendment that has several, also cancels Confederate war debt. That's a good one. And then the 15th Amendment, which assures that your right to vote cannot be taken away by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's what we'll get to the next one. Does anyone have any questions? Read this thing multiple times. Read the Constitution multiple times. And do not forget that you are taking this quiz that will be in week 3 in your regular class meeting. You are taking it as if it is 1877 and there are only 15 amendments. Just to put this in perspective, the 17th Amendment makes 17th makes senators elected by the people. If you look at a regular civics flashcards right now, it'll tell you senators elected by the people. Wasn't the case in 1877. Women did not have the right to vote at that point. That's the 19th Amendment. There were not 2 terms put on the president. That's the 22nd Amendment. You didn't have an insured voting at age 18. That's the 26th Amendment. Right? A lot of things change. So make sure you know that. And the reason I do this, just to be clear, is to make sure you understand why people are demanding these rights. They weren't there and they come in. There's also the 18th, which is dumb. That's when everybody was like, I don't think we should be able to drink anymore. And they were like, okay. And then like 15 years later, they're like, I'm thirsty. And they're like, oh, we'll get rid of it. They did that. We'll talk about that more later. Any questions? All right, you guys have a great day. Thank you for showing up for this lecture. This is awesome. I appreciate it.